The red sun hung low over Shirath, bleeding across the sky like a slow-burning wound. Its light soaked the desert city in shades of rust and flame. The air was dry, sharp, and heavy with the scent of smoke and scorched metal. In the center of the square, a fire pit roared, its flames dancing wild and impatient, hungry for what was to come. Elra stood at its edge. Her arms were bound in chains darkened by heat, her feet bruised from being dragged. Her face bore fresh cuts and older ones long faded. Dark purple hair tangled around her cheeks, and her golden eyes, wide with fear, refused to look away from the blaze. Above her, on a stone balcony carved from black marble, Lord Zarek watched. He wore his ceremonial robes as if they were armor, golden and flowing, the symbol of false power stitched across his chest. His voice echoed from the heights. "She is guilty," the crowd roared. "Traitor, burn her, justice for the crown." No one asked for proof. No one questioned the words. She was young, too young to hold power, and that made her dangerous. Beside her, two armored guards pulled at her chains, dragging her forward inch by inch. The heat singed her skin. The fire snapped louder, rising with each step she was forced to take. She didn't scream, didn't beg. She had tried that once before. No one had listened. The crowd leaned in. The guards raised their weapons. Then a voice broke the noise. "Let her go." It was not loud, not commanding, but it cut deeper than a scream. The crowd turned. From between their bodies, a figure emerged. Not tall, not armored. Just a man in worn boots, a sun-bleached jacket, and a calm in his walk that felt unnatural in a place like this. He was human, the first they had seen in years. The guards stepped forward, blades raised. "Leave now," one of them barked. "This is not your concern." The man didn't stop walking. He raised his hand slowly. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "But what you're doing, this is wrong." "She is a criminal," someone shouted. "She is a child," the man replied. "And even if she made a mistake, burning someone alive. Is that your idea of justice?" Zarek leaned forward, his smile sharp. "And who are you to speak in our court?" The man looked up. "Just someone who's seen fire before and knows what it takes from people." Zarek's smile vanished. "Kill him." The guards moved. Fast, but not faster than him. The man stepped in, struck the first in the throat, hard enough to drop him without killing. He twisted under the second, grabbed the spear shaft, and flipped the soldier onto the stone. Then he turned to Elra, chains still glowing from the heat. He didn't hesitate. He kicked the lock. Crack, it snapped. "Can you run?" She blinked, nodded. "Then run." They moved, together. Through the stunned silence, through hands too shocked to reach, through a wall of voices suddenly unsure. Behind them, energy blasts lit the sky. Zarek screamed from his tower, "Do not let them escape." But they were already gone. They did not stop running until the flames were far behind. They ducked into alleys, weaved through abandoned markets and dust-choked stairwells. The city howled above them, sirens, engines, voices raised in confusion. But in the shadows it was quiet. In one forgotten passage near the edge of the outer wall, they stopped. Elra collapsed to her knees, gasping. The man stood still, eyes watching the street. She looked up. "Who are you?" He didn't answer right away. Then finally, "Just someone who hates watching people get burned." She stared. "Why would you risk your life for me?" He looked at her, then at the sky, where smoke curled into red clouds. "Because I've seen fire before, and I know what it leaves behind." The city behind them still echoed with alarms. Distant shouts bounced off metal rooftops and faded into the endless red of the sky. Engines roared. Orders crackled through the comms of chasing guards. But here, on the broken edge of a forgotten bridge, there was only wind. It moved soft and slow, curling around the cracked stone like it had lost interest in the hunt. Jace crouched beside a pile of metal scraps, pulling pieces into a loose circle. His hands moved with quiet purpose. Elra sat a few feet away, her back against a rusted beam, legs pulled close to her chest. She watched him with suspicion at first, but now, mostly confusion. He sparked the small fire. Thin smoke rose. Flickering warmth pushed back the desert chill. She stared at the flames. They were going to burn me, she said. I know. Just like that. He nodded once. I thought someone would stop them. No one stops anything, Jay said, unless someone decides to. She looked at him. You decided. He didn't answer. Instead, he handed her a small protein bar, half cracked and sand-covered. She took it without a word. They sat in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable, just empty, like the air was waiting. Then Elra spoke again. They called me a traitor, but I didn't do anything. I know, Jace replied. She narrowed her eyes. How? He poked the fire gently. Because I saw your face. Guilt looks different. It hides. You were afraid, but you weren't hiding. Elra looked down. A long pause. Have you done things you're ashamed of? Jace's hand froze mid-motion. The flames snapped. He stared into them. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then quietly, yes, things I wish I could forget. But fire, it doesn't let you. It burns more than just your skin. It marks your memory. She watched him closely, not with fear, but with something softer. Not gratitude, respect. Jace leaned back, resting his hands on the dirt. You never told me your name. Elra, he nodded. Pretty name. Yours? He smiled faintly. Does it matter? Yes. Jace. She repeated it once, testing the sound. Then again. Jace. He looked at her. You're really not from here, are you? He shook his head. Not even close. Then why help me? He looked out toward the stars where the night sky was starting to swallow the last light. Because I've seen people stand by and do nothing, and I didn't want to be one of them again. The silence stretched again. This time it felt different, like the space between words had weight. She pulled her knees tighter. Do you think they'll keep hunting us? Yes. Even if we just disappear? Especially if we disappear. Elra looked at him. Then what do? We move. We stay low. We find somewhere they won't look. He stood, brushing dust from his pants. She followed. Where are we going? He pointed east, across the dunes, through the ashlands. She hesitated. That place is cursed. Jace looked at her, his eyes steady. So are we. He started walking. Elra paused, then followed. Behind them the fire cracked once more, then died. Above, the stars blinked into place, and far away in the shadows of a palace tower, a drone watched their escape, and someone smiled. The dunes stretched like frozen waves beneath the red sky. Jace and Elra moved across the sand in silence, the city far behind them now, its towers just slivers of dark metal against the horizon. The wind had picked up. It wasn't strong, but sharp, whispering across the landscape like it remembered what had burned here long ago. They walked without speaking. Elra stumbled once, her steps uneven. Jace offered her a piece of dry ration from his pack. She ate slowly, eyes never leaving the dunes ahead. He watched the ridge. He felt it in his gut. They were not alone. On the high ground above them, 3 bounty hunters waited. Each stood at a different angle, silent, armored, visors glowing faint red in the shadows. One carried a shock spear. Another held a net launcher. The third toyed with a blade, his fingers moving lazily. The leader, Commander Thrask, tapped a small screen in his gauntlet. It projected a map of the area and a glowing red dot where Jace and Elra were headed. They're moving toward the gorge, he muttered. A good place to trap them, one hunter said. No, Thrask replied, smiling behind his visor. We don't trap. We hurt. The first attack came from the right. A net shot out of nowhere. Thin, sharp wires designed to bind and shock on contact. Jace reacted without thinking. He shoved Elra down and spun, catching the net midair with his knife, slashing through it before it wrapped around them. He scanned the dunes. There, a flicker of movement. Instinct took over. He rolled forward, pulling Elra with him as an energy bolt slammed into the sand where they had just stood. Get behind that rock, he barked. She didn't argue. Another bolt sizzled past. Jace threw a handful of sand into the air. A shape moved, then another. 3 of them, fast, trained, coming in close. He drew his knife. No guns, no time. Just him and the dust. The first bounty hunter lunged. Jace dodged low, sliding under the man's reach, then slammed his elbow into the back of the hunter's knee. Armor cracked. The hunter dropped. Jace twisted, grabbed the shock rod from his belt, and smashed it across the man's helmet. One down. The second moved in with the blade. Jace blocked with his forearm, took the cut, and used the momentum to spin inside the strike. He drove his knee into the hunter's ribs, then flipped him onto the sand. Two down. The last one hesitated. Jace stared at him, breathing hard. "You want her? Come take her!" The hunter charged. Jace didn't wait. He ran forward, ducked the swing, and struck fast, low to the ribs, high to the throat. The hunter dropped to his knees. Jace grabbed his blade mid-fall, spun it once in his hand, then silence. From behind the rock, Elra watched wide-eyed. She stepped out slowly, dust swirling around her. "How did you—" Jace wiped the sand off the blade. "Used to be someone else," he said, "before I became a nobody." They looked down at the three fallen hunters. Jace checked their gear. Clean, no trackers, just hired killers. He knelt by one, pulled a patch from the armor. The symbol of the palace guard burned into the metal. "Zarek's reach is longer than I thought," he muttered. "They're not just bounty hunters. They're soldiers." Elra's voice was quiet. "He won't stop." Jace stood, the blade still in his hand. "Then neither do we." As the sun dipped lower, they moved again, faster, closer together. Elra kept glancing at Jace, his movements, his silence, his scars. "You're not just some traveler, are you?" He didn't look at her. "Number you were military." He nodded. "Special ops. A long time ago." "What happened?" Jace looked out at the fading sky. "They told us we were saving a colony, but it was a lie. We were the scare tactic. They sent us to burn it down." He paused. "I refused. They sent someone else instead." Elra swallowed. "You survived?" "Yeah, but no one else did." She didn't speak for a while. Then she said softly, "So that's why you fight? Because you remember." He looked at her. "Because no one else will." By the third day, the sand turned black. The skies over the ashlands were different. The sun hung higher, but the light felt thinner, as if it struggled to reach the ground. Ash drifted in the air, like snow that had forgotten how to fall. And the wind carried a smell Jace had known only once before. Old metal, dead fire, forgotten war. Elra walked beside him, her steps slower now. She didn't complain. Her eyes were sharper. She hadn't asked for rest since sunrise. Jace kept watching the horizon. "They're closing in," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know?" He lifted a small device, a heat sensor salvaged from one of the fallen bounty hunters. Faint trails, not far. She glanced around the empty expanse. "There's nothing out here." "That's the point," he replied, "and that's the trap." As they crossed a cracked plateau of jagged stone, the ground beneath them shifted, just slightly. Jace stopped. Too late. The surface collapsed. Dust and stone gave way. They fell. They hit the ground hard. Jace landed first, his shoulder absorbing the fall. Elra crashed beside him, coughing, hair filled with ash. Above them, the opening sealed in silence, as if it had never existed. Jace groaned. "You good?" She nodded, already pushing herself upright. "What is this place?" They looked around. It was dark, but not empty. Light flickered, soft blue strips running along the walls like veins. As their eyes adjusted, they realized they were standing in a chamber carved from obsidian, its shape unnaturally smooth, every corner precise. Symbols lined the walls, ancient, alien, familiar somehow. Elra stepped toward one of the carvings, running her fingers across the grooves. "I've seen this pattern before," she whispered. "Where?" "On the inside of the royal tombs." "This place is not part of the city," Jace said. "Number. It's older, much older." They moved deeper into the chamber. The air grew colder, the lights brighter. They passed through a narrow passage, emerging into a vast open hall. At the center stood a structure, a monolith shaped like a pyramid, but bent, twisted, rising from the ground at impossible angles. At its heart, a pedestal shimmered, and on it, a stone, glowing red, encased in a crystal housing. Elra froze. The crystal key. Jace looked at her. You said you took it. I didn't take all of it, she whispered. I took one piece. This is the other, the one they never wanted me to find. She stepped toward it. Suddenly, the room pulsed. The lights dimmed. A sound echoed. Not a voice. A warning. The walls began to shift, and something moved beneath the floor. Jace pulled her back. A crack spread across the far wall. Ash poured from the ceiling. A deep rumble filled the space. From behind the pedestal, something rose. It was not made of flesh, not machine. A guardian, 10 feet tall, black like volcanic glass, with arms that split into blades and a face carved from expressionless stone. It moved with no sound, no heat, no hesitation. It saw Elra. It moved forward. Jace stepped in front of her, blade drawn. The guardian paused, then spoke. Voice like layered echoes. Blood unknown. Access denied. She stepped forward, lifting the crystal key. I am Elra of the True Line, daughter of Averin, bearer of the code. The guardian tilted its head. Scan initiated. A beam of light swept across her chest. Silence, then. Bloodline confirmed. Command accepted. The guardian dropped to one knee. Jace lowered his blade, stunned. What did you just do? Elra looked down at her hands. I think I unlocked it. The truth. The monolith opened. Inside, a spiral staircase led downward. Cool air poured out, carrying the scent of age and memory. Jace turned to her. We don't have to go further yet. You just woke a war machine. Elra stepped toward the stairs. We came here for the truth. I won't run now. He followed her down. Below the temple, they entered a chamber filled with floating data crystals, each glowing with a different color. Elra reached for one. As her fingers touched it, a projection lit up the room. A recording. Her father, alive, sitting in a council room, voice calm. Zarek cannot be trusted. He has silenced 3 houses. He wants control of the vault. If I do not return, my daughter must know. He stopped, looked straight into the crystal. Elra, you must run. You must remember. You are the last truth left. The projection faded. Her breath caught. Tears touched her cheeks, silent and fast. Jace didn't speak. He simply stood with her, let her break in silence. Then softly, now we know. Now we fight. The chamber trembled. Not violently, not like fear, but like something ancient had exhaled for the first time in centuries. Jace stood in the heart of the hidden vault, his eyes sweeping the circle of glowing crystals floating around them. Each one carried a memory, a truth, a piece of a story someone once tried to erase. Beside him, Elra was silent. Her eyes still shimmered with the trace of tears, but her spine was straight now. Her hands no longer trembled. The face that had once belonged to a girl standing over fire was now the face of someone becoming. She reached forward, touched a second crystal. This one bloomed into a hologram of soldiers gathered in a council chamber. One of them was Zarek. He spoke with calm confidence. We control the narrative. If the people fear the bloodline, they will never question our rule. Let the girl burn. End transmission. The image flickered out. Elra looked at Jace. That's the proof. He nodded. It's more than enough. Her voice lowered. Then we send it. Now Jace pulled out a portable comm hub, patched into the crystal base. Signal is clean. We can piggyback it through the old relay tower east of here. Once it hits the net, the entire planet will see it. And the palace? They'll see it too. Above them, the sound of metal shifting returned. The Guardian stirred. It had stood silently since recognizing Elra's blood. Now it rose. Its arms glowed faintly. And then, it spoke. Command detected. Broadcast request confirmed. Will you activate the protocol of revelation? Jace and Elra looked at each other. What does it mean, he asked. Elra's voice was steady. If we agree, it transmits everything. Every file, every memory in this vault, to every satellite, every screen. The truth goes public. All of it. Jace stared at her. Are you ready for that? She stepped forward. They were ready to burn me alive over a lie. Let them burn now for the truth. She looked at the Guardian. Do it. The ground vibrated. The Guardian lifted its hands. A pulse of blue fire spread through the room. Soft, not hot, not dangerous. The crystals responded, lifting higher, spinning faster, glowing brighter. Above them, in the sky, a light beamed upward through the shattered rock ceiling, a single column of golden fire. And then, the transmission began. Across Zirath, screens blinked to life, in city centers, on wall terminals, inside the palace, on military ships, across border towns. The people of the planet stopped, turned, watched, and they saw Zarek, his lies, his face, the execution orders, the cover-ups, the blood on his hands. And then they saw her, Elra, alive, standing in the vault of fire, unbroken beneath the light of her ancestors. They saw the Guardian bow to her. They saw Jace at her side. And they saw something awaken that no tyrant could ever silence. Hope. In the capital, riots broke out. The guards refused to open fire. Walls were torn down. Palace banners burned. The people began to chant. Her name, not in hate, not in fear, but in memory and in defiance. Back in the vault, the broadcast finished. Elra stood still, her face pale from the rush. Jace placed a hand on her shoulder. You just started a war. She turned to him. Number, we ended one. Now it's just cleanup. Above them, the Guardian moved again. Command complete. Awaiting next instruction. Jace raised an eyebrow. Can it fight? Elra smiled faintly. It was built to protect the line of fire. It just remembered who that is. Far above in the palace tower, Zarek stood alone. He had silenced the news feeds, shut down the palace grid, but still, the sound of chanting reached his window, a name he tried to erase, now louder than the throne beneath his feet. He turned, and for the first time in years, he looked afraid. The sky over Zirath was no longer silent. From the vault of fire, a beam of golden light pierced the heavens, a beacon of truth that shattered the darkness. Across the planet, screens flickered to life, broadcasting the revelations uncovered by Elra and Jace. The people watched in stunned silence as the lies of Lord Zarek were laid bare, his treachery exposed for all to see. In the capital, the once loyal guards hesitated, their faith shaken. Citizens gathered in the streets, their voices rising in a chorus of defiance. The air was thick with tension, the city teetering on the brink of revolution. Elra stood at the forefront, her presence commanding. Beside her, Jace remained vigilant, his eyes scanning the crowd. The Guardian loomed behind them, a silent sentinel of justice. As they advanced toward the palace, the people parted, their eyes filled with hope. The gates, once symbols of oppression, creaked open, welcoming the tide of change. Inside, Zarek awaited, his confidence eroded. He attempted to rally his forces, but the guards stood down, unwilling to defend a fallen regime. Elra confronted him, her voice unwavering. Your reign ends today, she declared. Zarek, desperate, lunged forward, but Jace intercepted him, subduing the former ruler with swift precision. The throne room fell silent. Elra turned to the assembled crowd. This is not just a victory over tyranny, she proclaimed. It's the dawn of a new era, one where truth and justice prevail. The people erupted in cheers, their voices echoing through the halls. Hope had been restored, and the flames of truth burned brighter than ever. The streets of Zirath pulsed with energy. Citizens, once silenced by fear, now marched with determination. Their voices, unified and resolute, echoed through the city, signaling the end of oppression. Within the palace walls, Lord Zarek paced anxiously. The once mighty ruler, now a shadow of his former self, clung to denial. He barked orders to guards who no longer heeded his commands, their loyalty eroded by the unveiled truths. Suddenly, the grand doors of the throne room creaked open. Elra entered, her presence commanding. Clad in the regalia of her lineage, she bore the emblem of the true bloodline. Beside her stood Jace, ever vigilant. The room fell silent. Zarek's facade crumbled as he faced the embodiment of the truth he had long suppressed. Desperation overtook him, and he lunged forward, but Jace intercepted, delivering a decisive blow that sent the tyrant sprawling. Elra approached the throne, her gaze steady. She turned to the assembled crowd and declared, "This throne was never meant for fear, only for service. Today it belongs to all of us." A wave of relief and hope washed over the room. The people, once oppressed, now stood on the precipice of a new era. Outside, the city celebrated. Banners bearing the symbols of unity replaced those of tyranny. The air was filled with joy and the promise of a brighter future. Elra and Jace stood together, overlooking the reborn capital. Their journey had ignited a revolution, and together they would guide Xerath into a new dawn. The city had quieted. The fires of rebellion had cooled, leaving behind the soft glow of dawn. Xerath stood reborn, its people breathing the air of freedom. Jace stood at the edge of the launch platform, the wind tugging at his coat. The ship before him hummed softly, ready to depart. He gazed at the horizon, where the sun began its ascent, casting golden hues over the land he had helped liberate. Elra approached, her footsteps light but purposeful. In her hand, she held a small crystal, its surface catching the morning light. "For you," she said, extending the crystal. Jace took it, examining the intricate patterns etched within. "You don't need saving anymore," he remarked, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Elra met his gaze, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and something deeper. "Maybe not," she replied, "but maybe I still need you." They stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Then Jace stepped forward, enveloping her in a firm embrace. Pulling back slightly, he whispered, "If you ever need me again, don't call. Just whisper. I'll hear it." With a final nod, Jace turned and boarded the ship. The engines roared to life, and the vessel ascended, disappearing into the vastness of the sky. Elra watched until the ship became a mere speck against the azure canvas. She clutched the crystal tightly, a symbol of their journey and the bond forged in the crucible of revolution. And so concludes our tale, a story of courage, sacrifice, and the enduring spirit of those who choose to stand against tyranny. What are your thoughts on this journey? Share your reflections and let the legacy of Elra and Jace inspire others.